Welcome to the Click podcast. I'm Dani Watson, a mindset and manifestation expert and founder of The Click, a company that helps women overcome their fears and limiting beliefs to create a life and business that they love. Within this podcast, I will help you get clear on what you want, identify the blocks that are holding you back, transform your mindset and raise your vibration so that you can co-create magic with the universe. If you are looking to design a life that truly sets your soul on fire and manifest more success and abundance, then you are in the right place. Hello ladies, and welcome to a brand new episode. Now, I'm sure many of you listening to this will perhaps resonate with what I want to share in this episode. And I think you'll resonate whether you are a business owner or you're somebody within a career. And that is a fear around being seen, a fear around being visible and being fully visible, really allowing your light to shine brightly. Now, when I first started my business online, I hid behind my Instagram brand name. And I've seen a lot of online coaches especially do this, online business owners, where they really hold back from allowing themselves to be visible online, allowing themselves to be seen. And when I think back to the early days of my business, I had told myself, I don't know enough yet. And I just convinced myself this is the reason why I'm so afraid of showing my face or sharing my story or allowing the world to see me. Maybe I just don't know enough. And when I know more, then I will feel more comfortable and more credible in actually sharing content online. But my expertise started to grow. I started to have more accomplishments, more credentials, and I still realized like this fear of being seen, this visibility block was really standing in my way. And I realized it wasn't my lack of knowledge that was holding me back. I was actually scared of being seen. Now I know this is quite common, and I know it's something that can hold a lot of people back from embracing their potential. And I think many of us really longed to connect with the world, to contribute in a meaningful way, to share our ideas, yet we often shrink back at the thought of being noticed. So we maybe self-censor ourselves, maybe we just don't do it at all, we convince ourselves not yet, or we don't know enough yet, and we stay quiet. And often this hesitation isn't about our actual knowledge or our skills, it's about feeling uncomfortable, feeling vulnerable at the thought of being visible. So vulnerability, I think, plays a big role here, where our flaws or our insecurities, our imperfections, we feel like they're really open for everybody to judge and to criticize. So it can actually be a defense mechanism as a way to protect ourselves from that criticism, from rejection, just maybe people just not paying any attention at all to us. It might bring up the pain of past experiences, and therefore staying invisible, it might feel safe. But it comes with a heavy price. It comes with the inability to truly connect with people, to live authentically, to reach our potential, and to let the world and other people know who we genuinely are. So I want to use this podcast to really explore where this fear of visibility actually takes root and where it can often stem from past experiences or trauma or shame, and how keeping ourselves invisible can actually become a really big barrier to living the life that we truly want. Now, I want to preface this by saying that becoming visible, it's not about forcing ourselves into the spotlight or becoming, overly extroverted overnight. It's really about discovering a healthy visibility, and this will be different for everybody. A visibility where you personally feel grounded, you feel secure, you feel authentic in your interactions with others. So if you're somebody who's naturally more introverted, to then become somebody who's, going on stage and doing all of these things may not feel authentic to you. So it's really about learning how to overcome the fears that are keeping you hidden and gently stepping out of the shadows, showing up as you truly are, but doing so in a really authentic way. Now, I think a lot of women listening to this maybe will be thinking about visibility in a professional context. So whether you are a business owner, especially within the coaching space, or you're somebody that has a personal brand where showing up and being visible as perhaps an important part of your marketing and your business, or even in a career where being visible can help you get noticed, get recognized, get promoted within the workplace. So often we kind of think about visibility in that professional context, but visibility can also filter into our relationships, for example. So meaningful relationships, they're built on connection, trust, authenticity. And these are qualities that really require us to show up as we truly are. And when we keep ourselves invisible or small, or we sort of hide who we truly are, we are withholding parts of ourselves. And it makes it then very, very difficult for other people to truly know us. So I've realized that in my own visibility journey, I wasn't just keeping myself small when it came to my business in those early stages. I realized I had a real issue with being true and authentic when it came to being visible in front of other people. I was often hiding parts of my personality because of that. Again, the same things, fear of rejection, fear of being judged. Now, when it came to sort of this element and being seen fully within relationships, I kind of told myself like, oh, I'm just nervous, or I have sort of this shyness about me. But actually, I realized it was rooted in something deeper. Now, this fear of being seen, being visible, it's actually often a trauma response. So it's something that's formed from past experiences of judgment, of shame, rejection. If we are fearing being seen, being visible, if it feels unsafe, it's often because being seen has, at some point in our lives, it's been associated with pain. So this could be a range of different reasons. So it could be from being bullied, being humiliated. It might be you've been criticized in the past. Maybe you found yourself in a situation where you've been unfairly judged. And these moments, especially when they happen in our formative years, so our early childhood years, when these experiences can be deeply entrenched into our subconscious, these moments can create these lasting scars that actually linger into our adulthood. And these scars will subtly influence how we show up, or how we perhaps don't show up in the world. Now, I want to just say that trauma, it doesn't always need to look like some single catastrophic major life event. So trauma can actually be built up from smaller recurring experiences where we felt vulnerable and where we were met with either criticism, or we were dismissed, or we were mocked, or we were bullied. And these moments are going to then teach the subconscious mind that it's safer to just stay invisible, that blending in perhaps is a form of self-protection. And then over time, this becomes a familiar automatic response to situations where we perhaps risk being noticed or being judged. So being invisible then, keeping ourselves small, it becomes a survival mechanism, because the subconscious mind has learned that visibility is a threat. So in response to any type of painful experiences we've had in the past, it's going to adjust by creating patterns of avoidance or patterns of withdrawal. And the mind begins associated being seen with danger. So what happens basically in our brain, it starts to form these internal scripts. For example, like, oh, well, if I stand out, if I put myself out there, I'm going to be judged. Or if I share too much of myself or my story, I may be rejected. And this belief system, again, it's designed to protect us. It becomes this pattern of self-limitation. And it might feel like it's keeping us safe from certain risks, but again, it also is going to prevent us from fully experiencing opportunities in life, or from putting ourselves out there in a really meaningful way, or building meaningful connections. And this survival response can kick in any kind of everyday situations where it feels a bit risky to be seen. So it could be in a professional context. So it might be speaking up in a meeting. It might be sharing an idea, a creative idea in a meeting. It might be in a business context where you're at a networking event and there's somebody you really look up to and you hold yourself back from introducing yourself. Maybe you want to share some content on social media, but you feel afraid to do so. It may be that we find ourselves downplaying our strengths because we think, oh, well, if I am, seen as somebody who's really good at something, it's going to draw attention to me. So we're essentially avoiding anything that's going to give us that unwanted attention. And we basically sideline ourselves from these moments or opportunities that could really allow us to grow. Now, this desire to stay invisible often has deep psychological roots. And at its core, this drive, it's linked to things like self-preservation. It's linked to shame. And it's also linked to, you may have heard these terms before, the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And actually understanding some of these things can help us understand more about why we might be feeling afraid to be seen, or why we might be keeping us small or invisible. So self-preservation, kind of like what we've just discussed, it's really about how our past experiences have made us want to protect ourselves from certain threats. So for example, let's say you were judged. Let's say you were singled out in class for doing something wrong. Maybe you were humiliated in some way. There's so many different situations we could have experienced as a child. Maybe we've just misunderstood. Something that really stands clear in my mind from a child was I went up to a teacher and I asked if I could play. We had in our classroom a Playmobil, and I was just asking in what I felt was a polite way, but I had my arms folded. And I remember her saying, "Don't be rude. How dare you come up to me and ask if you can play with the Playmobil and have your arms folded?" And it must have seemed as if I was demanding this. But it's funny how this is really stuck into my brain, because I remember in that moment feeling really upset and really misunderstood, because something that I was always wanted to be was to be liked and to be polite. And I was very much had it drilled into me, we've got to respect our elders, we've got to respect our teachers. And I felt so misunderstood in that moment. And I definitely feel as an adult, I've had this underlying feeling of being misunderstood. Maybe people won't see my good intentions. And yeah, so it's interesting how we can kind of connect these dots between sort of these early childhood experiences and how we are able to show up in our life as an adult. And then shame can also be a really powerful motivator when it comes to staying invisible. So let's kind of distinguish it from guilt, because I think the two sometimes they're sort of interlinked, but they are different. So guilt will often stem from regret over certain actions, whereas shame is more about a feeling of being inherently flawed or not enough, that unworthiness. So experiences that can create shame, they may be things like being criticized, belittled, made to feel inadequate. And again, these experiences can create this strong desire to keep ourselves small. And people that are driven by shame may feel like if they are seen, their defects, their flaws, their shortcomings, they're also going to be exposed. So they just cannot stand the thought of being visible, because it's well, they're going to see all of these flaws. And then it kind of creates this cycle. If they see these flaws, I'm then going to feel even more unworthy and more unlovable when I'm rejected because of these flaws. And then we've got the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses. So when we think of our survival instincts, these are kind of the responses that come to mind. It's our body's automatic response to threat. And we tend to gravitate to one or two of these. We tend to kind of favor a particular response. So for me, it's typically flight or freeze. So if I am stressed, I've kind of really gravitated to sort of those two responses. So for example, let's take back to before I started my business and my life was in a hot mess and financially I was in a mess. I'd just finished a toxic relationship, and my sort of response to the chaos in my life and the overwhelm I was feeling was to go, fuck it. I'm getting on a plane and I'm going to go and get a job as a chalet girl. It was this flight response. I just wanted to kind of forget everything, leave everything behind and flee. But then I often find within my work, if I get overwhelmed, I get into a freeze response where I just shut down. If there's too many things going on, if I overcommit to things, if I have too many things going on in my plate work-wise, I feel like I just cannot do anything, and I will shut down and I will do nothing, or I will sort of zone out by binge watching TV. So they're kind of my two typical responses, but people can kind of fight, or we also have the fawn response as well. So fight is when we get sort of really overly defensive to certain situations, or the fawn, this is about really people-pleasing others as a way to perhaps avoid conflict or disapproval, and we essentially are suppressing our own desires or our own identity. Now, each of these responses can actually contribute to our desire to stay invisible. So the way that we react, it might be linked with our invisibility seeking behavior. So let's take the fight response, for example. Though this is actually one of, I would say, probably one of the least common responses in when we're seeking to keep ourselves invisible. But you may have somebody who will be perhaps rejecting opportunities where they may be noticed. So this response, it's really about pushing things away, pushing away situations that could expose vulnerabilities. Or if somebody is more prone to the flight response, for these people, the most common response if they want to be unseen is to take flight. So withdraw themselves from attention. So we might avoid social situations. We might stay away from things that are going to put us in public recognition. We might actively distance ourselves from certain situations where visibility is encouraged. And then in the freeze response, if somebody typically responds in this way, it's almost that feeling of being paralyzed by the thought of exposure. And I've seen this a lot actually when women I've worked with have had this fear of showing up online. It's almost like they just cannot think of what to say. And I had a client actually a few months ago, which I could really resonate with what she was telling me because I'd experienced this before, where she had organized to do a live stream on her social media and she went live and it was just like she froze. She could not get her words out. But it might not be as dramatic as that. It might just be holding back in conversations. It might be staying quiet. It might be hesitating to share your opinions because you're worried about being judged or rejected. And then the reform response, which is much more about placating other people, perhaps to avoid conflict or to avoid disapproval. So in the form response, what we're doing is we are suppressing our voice. We're suppressing our desires. We are hiding our true identity, keeping ourselves small. And those who typically respond by fawning, they may start to try and adapt to other people's preferences. So maybe they will just agree with others. They will perhaps change how they show up or shy away from showing up at all to avoid, again, displeasing other people. So all of these mechanisms, whether it's self-preservation, shame, or the fight, flight, freeze or fawn response, essentially these are intended to protect us. But what happens is they trap us in this cycle of suppressing ourselves, keeping ourselves small, keeping ourselves invisible. And when our desire to stay invisible, when it's motivated by either self-preservation or shame or these survival responses, it actually then becomes a barrier to expressing ourselves in a really authentic way. It prevents us from showing up fully and, embracing our potential. So actually just recognizing where kind of the root of our invisibility desires come from, we can actually really understand that this fear of being seen is actually natural. It's a natural human response. So it's nothing we need to beat ourselves up about, but it's also something that we can learn to navigate in a more effective way. Now, I want to quickly just touch upon the cost of visibility because I think for many of us, we think of, it's being judged, being criticized. So getting visible essentially magnifies these fears of failure or rejection. But what was interesting when I did my own work around visibility was the fear of loss of control. And something that I've really kind of done a lot of work around is my need to control the outcome. I like to micromanage things. I like to plan ahead. I like to kind of know what's going to happen. And feeling out of control makes me feel very unsafe. And it's something I've done a lot of work around. But it was interesting how it came into the visibility piece, because when we are getting visible, we're exposing ourselves to being vulnerable. And I think one of the reasons why vulnerability feels so scary is because we are relinquishing control over how others perceive us. So when we are getting visible, whether that's showing up online or, speaking up in a meeting, we're basically opening ourselves up to different interpretations, different judgments. various responses, and we can't manage these responses or predict how somebody's going to respond to us. And sometimes we might get misunderstood, or people might interpret what we're saying in an inaccurate way. And we don't necessarily always have control over this. And so this loss of control, it can actually feel quite intimidating. It can feel scary. And it really, again, taps into this deep-seated fear of being misunderstood, being misjudged, or perhaps even being dismissed. So for me, going back to what I said earlier about this experience as a child, being completely misunderstood and misread by a teacher, that really stuck with me. And so I can really see how that need to control really shows up in my adult life, and fearing being visible, because being visible means vulnerability, and it means I'm relinquishing that control over how others perceive me. Something that I've really battled with, I think, showing up in the online space is that your online identity is essentially in the hands of others. And we want to show up as authentic. We want to show up as ourselves. But first of all, we might worry, well, what if I am judged or criticized whilst I'm being authentic and being myself? But then there's also, well, I could be being as authentic as possible, but I might be misunderstood and people might take me the wrong way. I think in the type of cancel culture in which we live in, I think this is even more prevalent, where people are sometimes very unfairly called out for what they've said or how they've acted, and sometimes rightly so. I think the online space is a powerful place for people to be held to higher levels of professionalism and integrity. And I think in some ways that's a good thing. But then we have this sort of cancel culture where it feels like people are being picked apart for very small things. And I think that can feel like a real threat, especially for a business owner that, let's say, has a personal brand and whose sort of business requires her to sort of show up and allow her personality to be seen. The thing is, not everybody's going to like us or resonate with us, but it's something that we can't necessarily predict. The unpredictability of other people's reactions can actually feel a really scary thing. And it's especially challenging for anybody that's experienced trauma. And again, trauma doesn't need to be this big catastrophic event. It could be as simple as receiving constant criticism as a child, but experiencing this trauma essentially amplifies our need for control, because that's how we feel safe. And when we're visible, we no longer have that full control about how others will respond. So I was actually working with a client at the end of last year, and she was somebody that was relatively high up within her career, and visibility was something that we were working on together. And so she had no issues in getting visible and showing up, but she felt like she was doing so in a way that was very much out of alignment with who she was. So she was kind of feeling like she needed to be this sort of boss bitch and quite a hard woman within meetings, when interacting with her team, when sort of liaising with the board. And she knew that visibility was important, but she felt like she wanted to be more authentic with how she was showing up. And something that came up for her was this feeling like she didn't have control. So she'd very much curated this image of how she wanted to perceive, because she felt like if she was being visible and doing that in an authentic way, she was basically handing over her identity into the hands of others, and their reactions could be unpredictable. So we really sort of dug into this, and something that kind of came up from her childhood was that she lived in a very unpredictable childhood where she had parents that would blow very hot and very cold. So it was a very volatile house, and she kind of never knew what to expect. And so because she couldn't control the reactions of her parents, she tried to create control in other ways. So anything that she could control, she would try and control it. And so this kind of controlling behavior showed up in was very prevalent in lots of areas in her life. So for example, it was also prevalent in her relationships, and especially within her work environment. She had associated things that were unpredictable to feel unsafe, because it was very much linked back to that time in her childhood where that unpredictability of her parents' moods meant she felt at times unsafe. Now, what happens when we experience a type of trauma such as this is that it creates this strong desire for self-protection. safety becomes our top priority, often at the expense of our self-expression. So this is exactly what was happening for this client. She was shying away from expressing who she really was and being authentic, being visible in an authentic way, because safety was always her top priority. And for her, safety meant she had to be in control. Now, when it comes to actually transforming this fear of being seen, I think what is really important is to actually define what authentic visibility actually looks like for you. So actually creating healthy visibility, which is really about showing up in a way that feels true to who we are, grounded in authenticity, grounded in self-respect, and not in a way that's going to send our nervous system into overdrive. So let's say you're somebody that really shies away from being seen, and then you force yourself to meet certain standards of visibility, or adopt an image that doesn't really resonate with you. That's just going to make you feel even worse. So healthy visibility is about really defining, okay, how can I be seen in a way that actually feels empowering, it feels intentional, and is really aligned with my core values? So if we want to be really authentic, we need to have that self-awareness of, okay, well, when it comes to visibility, what parts of myself do I want to share, and why do I want to share them? Because if we are able to connect with our intentions, we can actually make sure we shape visibility in a way that actually honors who we are, rather than, who we think that we should be. And I see this play out, especially again online, in people that need a personal brand, and they assume that they have to show up in a certain way. They have to be the most confident person in the room to be respected or to be seen as credible. And it therefore keeps them from actually showing up at all, because they think, well, I can't show up in that way. That's just not who I am, and I want to be authentic. So it's important to recognize your own boundaries of what you want to share, what you feel comfortable sharing, and what you'd perhaps rather keep private. What does authentic self-expression actually look like for you in a professional context, but also in relationships as well, also in social settings? So if you can actually anchor visibility in these values and goals, you can actually then approach being seen as a really empowering experience, rather than something that's going to feel either really scary or almost performative, where you're basically feeling like you fake it until you make it. We don't necessarily need to do this. It's about adopting a measure of visibility that's going to feel authentic and true for you. And I think it's also worth pointing out that we can create our own boundaries and balance when it comes to being vulnerable and showing up and getting visible and actually creating privacy for ourselves. And again, this is especially relevant for personal brands. Being visible doesn't mean exposing every aspect of ourselves. And we could be really visible, but we could still have very strong boundaries in place that actually protect our well-being, and they make us feel safe. So it's creating this balance between vulnerability and privacy, and learning how to actually share openly and honestly, but without giving away more than what we feel comfortable giving. And so if we are able to kind of find our own balance, we can then create that sense of security while still connecting in a very meaningful way. And there are no rules here. You get to shape the parameters of how you want to show up and how you want to be visible, whether that's in a personal or professional context. So what parts of yourself do you want to kind of hold back? Maybe there's certain spaces where you may hold back that feel perhaps less supportive. Maybe there's certain spaces where you will allow more of yourself to be seen and more of your story to be heard. But again, those boundaries are for you to set. Now, when it comes to practical strategies to overcome this visibility trauma, there's lots of things that we can use. So building self-compassion is going to be key. So any type of exercise that's designed to develop self-compassion is a foundation for healing. Self-affirmation practices, so small daily routines that are going to reinforce your self-worth or your readiness to be seen. But something that I also love is gradual exposure. So a technique like a graded exposure therapy, which is going to help you overcome this fear of being seen, but doing so in a really gradual way. So let's say, for example, you have never got visible on social media and you're wanting to do this more. let's say, to commit to doing a live stream every day, sharing some of your deepest, darkest secrets might feel a little bit too much. Gradual exposure, it's essentially an approach to being seen, which will allow you to face your fears in this really measured and manageable way. So graded exposure therapy then, it's often used in therapeutic contexts. It basically, what you do is you confront anything that's an anxiety-inducing situation. So let's say it is showing up online. You do it step by step rather than going full steam ahead and doing it all at once. So it's basically gradually exposing yourself to some degree of visibility, which will help break that cycle of avoidance. And it really helps to build a path of confidence and resilience, but do so in a very comfortable and empowering way. So essentially, you're taking really small incremental steps towards your visibility goal. And each kind of incremental step, it's designed to push the boundaries a little bit more out of your comfort zone, just slightly. So giving yourself a chance to feel more secure, gradually feel safer being seen with each kind of new step that you take. And doing this incrementally, it's going to help you build that confidence slowly. It's going to give your nervous system time to adjust and create this sort of positive feedback loop where you feel capable of handling more and more and more over time. Okay, because what's going to happen if you kind of go from 0 to 100 overnight, your nervous system is just going to go into overdrive, and then you will typically go to one of those responses, the fight, flight, freeze or fawn response. Often it might be that freeze response where you just do nothing at all. I've seen this so many times play out with women on social media where they try to go sort of all guns a-blazing, kind of go from zero visibility to everything all at once, and they just get so overwhelmed, they freeze and they do nothing. And they kind of just don't manage to get the ball rolling. Now, if this is a topic that resonates with you, then I am so excited to let you know that in the Thalia app, we have a comprehensive workshop designed to help you overcome your blocks to being visible. And as part of that workshop, you're going to understand more about the trauma of being seen and how we can actually break through our patterns to show up in the world, be visible, be seen, but do so in a really authentic way. So during the workshop, we're going to dive deeper into really understanding this desire to stay invisible and where it comes from. So the roots of invisibility, and diving deeper also into the trauma connection. So the concept of trauma and how it can actually lead to this desire for self-protection and how it can become this coping mechanism. We'll also explore more the different types of trauma leading to invisibility. So it might be childhood trauma invisibility, so the impact of early childhood experiences, whether that's in family dynamics, neglect, shame. We'll look at things like social and cultural trauma, so looking at how societal expectations or discrimination or cultural norms can actually contribute to our desire to stay invisible. We'll look at things like workplace and interpersonal trauma. So toxic environments in the workplace or maybe even in relationships can actually reinforce invisibility as a defense mechanism. We'll also go into the neuroscience of visibility. So how the brain processes fear and anxiety that is related to being visible. We'll look at how memories of traumatic events influence our response to visibility. And then we're really going to dive into how we can transform this fear of being seen. So we'll look at practical strategies to overcome visibility trauma, including gradual exposure therapy. We'll also look at ways that we can build resilience and build inner safety. So help our body to feel safe to be seen. And then we'll also redefine visibility. So explore how we can, create visibility that's going to feel really empowering, that's going to feel really authentic. And we'll look at how we can do this both in a professional context, but also in your personal life as well. So in relationships, whether that's romantic relationships or friendships, allowing you to be seen, to be visible, and do so in a really authentic way. So again, if you want to dive deeper into this, you can head to theclickacademy.com/Thalia. Thalia. So Thalia. So that's theclickacademy.com/Thalia. All of the information will be found on that page, and we'll post some information into the show notes as well. Ladies, it was so lovely connecting with you on this episode. I hope you found this useful. And for those of you, again, who are wanting to dive deeper, you'll be able to find more inside the Thalia app. If you are wanting to build your own successful online coaching business, make sure to check out Freedom, Abundance and Impact, our free 10-day business and mindset course for coaches and aspiring coaches. To access, simply head to wearetheclick.com and click free course in the menu.